And yeah, okay, next I would like to actually invite our first speaker, which is Adam Burmister, and he's going to speak about designing for the next billion.
Let's go, I got this. Alrighty. Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for turning out. This is a lot bigger crowd than I was expecting. So I've also got this amazing stage, and I feel like I've got a Lady Gaga microphone on. So it's really exciting for me to be back in Malaysia. This is probably my 5th or my 6th visit. And it's really great to be able to come back and feel the enthusiasm about the entrepreneurial space in Malaysia. And I think there's so much opportunity here, and it's really exciting to be invited and to share with you, and to see friends in the audience from startups that I've been involved with in Malaysia. Before I started today, I wanted to ask kind of what the audience broke themselves into. Who here is a founder? Okay. And who's from a technical background? All right, cool. So what's everyone else doing? All right, we're going to walk through this. So my name's Adam Burmister. I'm a web engineer. I've been working for over 10 years in the startup space. And in that time, I've been away from New Zealand. So I've been living in the UK for about 6 years, where I worked for companies like the BBC and founded my own startups. And I've been in the US for the past 4 years, where I've been working at companies like Xero, which is a New Zealand online cloud accounting company, and Pinterest. And then over that time, I've also been involved in Service Hero, which hopefully some of you know from the Malaysian landscape. So I've picked out a few of these logos just to highlight the range of growth stages that I've been involved with these companies. So from the really early stages all the way through to these massive institutions like the BBC. I know on the schedule it says Adam Burmister from Pinterest, and that was absolutely true until Monday of this week. I've actually just accepted a brand new position at Stripe, who is the online payments processing company. So I'm super excited to be back and getting more involved back in the SMB sort of stage and helping entrepreneurs take payments. I know they're not in Malaysia yet, I believe, but they're in Singapore, so I'll see what I can do. Cool, so usually when I'm talking more about the engineering focus of things. Today I'm talking more about what I've learned at Pinterest in the last couple of years, which is about growth engineering. So it's about how do you progress companies from the early stages through to the massive scales at the later end of Pinterest and the BBC. So this is the birthplace of Service Hero. So Service Hero started off in like the food courts of Kuala Lumpur for the free Wi-Fi. Yeah, so the story of this was I was on holiday in New Zealand, and I had a phone call from my friend Carl, who was a Malaysian guy, and had just come back to Malaysia, and he wanted to do a startup. And he said, I need some help doing some UI design and some UX. For this company I want to do, and help with the pitch deck design. So I said, yeah, sure, I'll help out. And then accidentally, somehow, I got involved in a startup in Malaysia. And we managed to raise some funding and build it out. I think this photo is from about a year ago, where I think the company was like 80 people. So really great sort of growth over a 2-year period from that food court through to where we are today. And then this is the Xero apartment phase. So this is the garage of Apple had the garage, Xero had the apartment. So this is apartment 404, which I always found really funny for a tech web startup. But this was the first logo we had before we have this is the official Xero logo today. And there's literally like, I don't know, 12 people crammed into this one little apartment. And the day I joined, we loaded all the laptops and the computers onto the chairs, and we wheeled it out of the apartment into our first office down the street. And today, Xero is probably a $4 billion market cap company. So a really huge growth over the last 10 years. Pretty much all around the world. It's the #1 online accounting system in the UK and New Zealand, I think Australia as well. And think about the growth lessons that I could learn from these different stages. So at Service Hero, it was very growth hacky. So we did a whole bunch of things in the early days. So like the one case which comes to mind is someone decided to use Tinder as a way to promote Service Hero. So they set up a profile and that's match with people and sort of then promote the Service Hero. As we go through like Zero, the growth strategy was very hands-on in the early stages. So it's about how do you win those first 100 customers. And we had a sales team like literally dragging people over the line to get those first sales. And today I'm working at Pinterest. So Pinterest is one of the unicorns. So this is a company with $1 billion market cap. So I think at the latest public figure, Pinterest is valued around $12 billion US. So this is a private company. And Pinterest's business model is based on advertising. So we have users who upload content, but primarily the content is uploaded by businesses. And then we have the potential to offer them advertising to distribute their content on Pinterest to even more people. So I've been working on the advertiser growth team, which has been all about sort of nudging people along that pipeline to get more sales and more revenue for the company. So I've seen lots of growth stages throughout my career, from the really small to the massive stages here. And it's just at the upper level. So a company like Pinterest, the numbers just get astounding. So a $12 billion private company is pretty amazing. And I found that travel is really important for entrepreneurs. So coming from New Zealand, which is a population of 4.5 million people, when I traveled to the UK for the first time, I've just found it eye-opening at the potential markets that are really there. So I know, like, in Malaysia, you've got a large company, you've got a lot of large neighbors, but I'm really going to encourage you to think big in this talk today. So what I want to talk about is the advertiser growth aspect. So the next billion. When I got the email to invite me to talk today, I was quite excited. So I'd been wanting to do a bit more public presentations, and I got this email, and I said, great, what would you like me to talk on? And she said, the next billion. So I said, yeah, fantastic. I didn't want to look stupid, so I didn't want to email back and say, what does that mean? Because I'm not quite sure what it did mean at the time, so I sort of started thinking about what a billion is. So a billion is 10 to the 9. Which is 1 followed by 9 zeros. And that's a really difficult number to comprehend in the human brain. Like, it's just too large for us. So I started thinking about ways I could break it down into something that's a bit more tangible to hold on to. So if we think about 1 billion years in, 1 billion seconds, it turns out that like, probably most of the room weren't born yet. I was only just born, I think. If we were to look at it in minutes, that would mean that we're back in the days of the Roman Empire. And if we were to do it in hours, where our ancestors were living in the caves still. If we're doing it months, it means the dinosaurs are still roaming the earth. So it's just this massive number. And then we get something like this, so 2 billion. Can anyone guess what 2 billion refers to? So this is the monthly active users, the MAU, the monthly active users of Facebook. So every month, Facebook gets 2 billion people to use its services. So that's like a quarter of the world is using Facebook. So 1 in 5 minutes spent online is spent on Facebook. And it's only when you sort of understand the scales here that you can really understand the power, commercial power of a platform like Facebook. And this is the growth curve of Facebook. So if we look back about 10 years ago, Facebook was actually growing pretty flat month on month. And they sort of recognized this, and they decided they need to do something about this. So they were the first in the industry to sort of work towards creating a growth engineering team. So this is a team of engineers whose job is to accelerate the growth curve of Facebook. This is quite a long quote, but so this is an early stage member of the Facebook team, and the bit in red is kind of the important bit. So after all their testing, what they realized was to get any individual to 7 friends in 10 days, that was it. So there's a tipping point in the user journey where you can express so much value and you get them so engaged in the product that they get locked into the product. And the way they got to this learning was through a lot of experimentation and a lot of learning, experiments in learning and iterating. All right, 100 billion. Massive number, right? Can anyone guess what this one is? So there's 100 billion pins on Pinterest today. So that's things like the images and the links and the titles and the descriptions. And it's just an enormous number. So to contemplate how you would technically even store that information on your computer systems, like how do you have databases large enough to hold this data? How do you serve all those images quickly over the internet? So these are huge engineering problems, and yet we managed to accomplish it. So it seems like it's an impossible problem, but I encourage you to have faith in the talents of your engineers and technology. 817 billion. So this is Apple's market cap. So this is the largest company in the world, I think maybe in history. It's probably going to be the world's first trillion-dollar company. So absolutely enormous. You should all aim for this. And I really love this graph. So this is Walmart versus Amazon. So Walmart, if you don't know, is one of the giants of the American retail landscape. And if we look at the Walmart growth curve in blue, you can see it's just rapidly outpaced by Amazon. So from this, obviously, we can say that the tech companies don't grow in the same way that traditional companies do. And the skills required are much different for growth than it is for physical retail. So hopefully from this, I've shown that there's evidence that you can, A, grow to billions of users, B, that you can grow to billions of pieces of content and solve those technical problems, and C, that you can grow to billions in revenue. So this is probably the first example of, say, growth engineering that I'm aware of. So this is back in 1997 by a company called Hotmail, who do email. And through this little email signature line, which they added at the bottom of every email that you wrote on Hotmail, they managed to gain millions of users. And this is at a time which is relatively early on in the internet's history, and that was a massive gain. So generally, this sort of work is an example of growth hacking versus growth engineering. And we talk about growth hacking a lot in early stage startups. As a growth engineer, I sort of despise to use the word growth hacking in my work. And the reason is that the growth hacking examples are probably a lot more short-term focused. They're haphazardly done, often unmeasured, and can tend towards dark patterns. So things that aren't particularly great for the user experience at the expense of driving some of the company metrics up. So I think these definitely have a value and very valuable for the very early stages, like Service Hero uses this Tinder example. But at some stage, you want to get a lot more scientific and methodical about your implementation. And that's when you kind of transfer from growth hacking up to growth engineering. So this would be an example, say, a contrived example of an experiment which I might run on my website. We can say that the business came to us and said, right, Adam, I want you to collect more information about our users, So let's implement a Facebook sign-up button. So when we sign up with Facebook, we get some more access to user data. If I look at that from the user perspective, there's not a huge amount of value. So say I implemented this on the page, and we haven't seen that much uplift, not many people engage with the button, and I'm asked to, as a growth engineer, go figure out how to make this feature better. So here is a potential treatment. So an experiment has a control group and it has a treatment group, and I'm going to make one small change to this button. And this is a real-world example, actually. So I think WhatsApp did pretty much that, feeling lazy. And from that, they saw a 20% increase in click-through rates. And that's quite surprising. So it's a very small piece of engineering work, but with a large lift. And all we've really done there is convey to the user that there's some sense of value in this feature which they hadn't perceived before. So if I was to put myself in the user's emotional state, I've just saved them a little bit of time by being able to quickly log in. And it sort of makes sense, right? As an engineer, I should be able to say, the user's purpose in coming to my website is not to log in. You know, that's kind of secondary. They just want to be logged in so they can use the app. So this sort of thing drives the growth engineering mindset. So what is growth engineering? Well, I would say really it's a process. And this is a nice little graphic which explains the process loop. And generally what that means is we're going to come up with a whole set of experiments which we want to run. We're going to prioritize them, we're going to implement them, and we're going to test them. At the later stages of this loop, we're going to analyze the results from those experiments, and then we're going to feed the learnings from those experiments back into the loop. So we've got this never-ending cycle of iterations and new experiments and new features coming out on the website. And sort of related to this is a quote which used to be quoted quite often around zero. And I think it's a really good analogy for growth in that it encapsulates the risk and the difficulty of growing a company. So this is a photo of a paraglider taken back in New Zealand. And this is a sport I actually did when I was very young. So I think I was about 16 or 17 when I first started to learn how to paraglide. And it really taught me a lot about risk. So there's a saying in paragliding, there's old pilots and bold pilots, but not both. So you have to learn to judge your risks versus reward. And I think in the early stages of a business, it's very much the same. So you need to take the risks, but you need to judge the potential reward for it. And in this case, it's a flappy piece of fabric above your head as you run off a cliff. And it feels a lot like founding your first startup to me. And to get that lift, the growth off of your piece of fabric is quite difficult. But hopefully you get to it, and at some stage you have to transfer up. You have to move up to building something more like an airline. So instead of carrying one person, now you're carrying 500 people. And of course, to do that, you need to basically reconfigure your aircraft while in flight. So you need to build some jet engines and stick them on your wings. And at this point, you should have built a business that's repeatable and efficient and serving many different customer types. And at some stage, obviously, you need to, if you're going for the billion-dollar business, you need to escape Earth's gravity. And to do that, you need to reconfigure your aircraft into a rocket. And that's pretty much what I think the growth engineering stuff is. So this is towards the later phases of growth, probably. But if we look at this graph here, say the dotted line is what your organic growth would have been. So if you didn't really do much, you just kept doing some of the basic marketing things. I think what growth engineering is the rocket fuel here. So the thing that's turning that red line up steeper so you can get that exponential growth, the traditional hockey stick growth curve that we're all after. And if you're a founder, which most of you are in this room, this is probably what your growth curve looks like today, and this is very true, I think. This is a lot more realistic than the traditional one. So this is a bit of a comic, but there's a lot of wiggles in this curve, and that's very true in practice. So even as a growth engineer, working at a later stage growth company, you'll still see lots of wiggles happening. You have to sort of filter out the noise. And you'll also notice that like the growth is additive. So it will be, you try one thing, it works for a while perhaps, maybe it drops off a little, but you're trying new things constantly, and you're always stepping up your growth. So, in the last 2 years, I've been working in growth engineering, particularly in advertiser growth at Pinterest, and I thought I'd go over the things that I've learned in that time and see if I can share it. Each company has their own approach to growth. It's a very young field, so there's not really much published on it yet. And there's a tendency for every company who's implementing a growth team to go off and build their own tools. So there's not a huge amount of standardized tool sets that I can share with you yet, but I will do some of that later. But we can walk through the process, and I think that's the really important thing, is just to learn how to do that. So we're going to talk about how we're going to make bets in growth engineering, and I'll give you a blueprint on how to set up a team and run a team for growth. So the first thing I would say about growth engineering is it's a very unique discipline. And I'm not even sure engineering is the right term. So it turns out that, I mean, as an engineer, you're generally doing large pieces of complex work over many months, perhaps, to deliver a feature. With growth engineering, it's very small. So you're doing very small changes like that label which we added to that button. But they can have very large lift. So if we think about the Facebook example, the Facebook sign-in button, it wasn't really a technical problem, it was more of a design problem. And that sort of shows us it's about thinking right. It's about understanding the psychology of the users and the users' goals and putting ourselves in their position and helping them get to what they're trying to achieve. So small experiments, early delivery, and a lot of iteration. And the whole point of this is to get some signal from the user. So early on, you don't want to overcommit to a feature because you don't know what the user really wants. So it's better to try a whole bunch of different things, see which ones fail and which ones work, and sort of work down the success paths. It's also quite unique because it's very multidiscipline. Traditionally, engineers only are focusing on the engineering problems, especially at the larger scale companies where you've got the ability to focus into a particular niche skill. Within growth engineering, you need to have a good engineering sense, and usually with a front-end focus, but you also need to bring in skills like a growth hacker. You need to think about unique ways that you can use the limited resources that your company has, traditionally a startup has, in order to sell to your users. You need to be good at marketing enough that you can think about how to communicate the value proposition to the user. And I think, most importantly, you need to be a data analyst. So you need to be able to read the numbers coming back from your experiments to know how to drive your focus in the future. And I think most of you have probably been exposed to growth engineering as a consumer of products today. So you've probably gone to something like Facebook and logged in and seen some weird change which wasn't there before. So maybe the chat sidebar moved from the left to the right or to the bottom. And then a month later, you would have seen that it's actually disappeared. And you go, oh, where'd it go? So that was probably an experiment treatment group. And there's hundreds of these running probably at any one time. So I know from Pinterest, as a Pinterest user, you go to the website, you're probably being exposed to 100+ experiments at any one time. There's a lot of things running constantly. And this is pretty much how all the big guys do it. So any large consumer web app is going to be running a ton of experiments. And they'll be collecting data on your activity. And they probably have been collecting data on your activities for the last 10 years or so. So I'd be very surprised even if Facebook has ever deleted a log file based on your activity. So when we talk about data being the new oil, that's sort of what we mean. All that past experience from users on the website can be used to train the experiments and run experiments in the future. So the next thing is what works for others won't work for you. So there is no silver bullet in growth. And that's because your company is different, your users are different, maybe your delivery platforms are different. So it's very difficult to be able to say, here's a playbook of things that you can go and do, and you will get growth from this. So what that means is you're going to have to go and try a whole bunch of things. You're going to have to fail a bunch, and you're going to have to learn from those failures. And it's data science. So if you don't have a statistics background, go find a good book on statistics. You need to know how to set up a good experiment, so it's a fair experiment, so you're not biasing your results. You're going to need to know how to segment your users up properly, so you're targeting the right people. And you're going to need to know how to read the results of an experiment. So if nobody knows what statistical significance is, that's obviously something that's very important. You need to know that your experiment has run long enough, with enough users through, that the results weren't just a luck of the draw result. All right, so I'm going to introduce a new section, Adam's Adages. So an adage is a proverb or a short statement expressing a truth. And I love to just trot these out in meetings to make myself sound extra wise. But here's my first one. You make what you measure. So pick good metrics to measure. Because this is an experiment, we need to be tracking the numbers to analyze. So the pro tip here is just measure everything. So in my case, my work on Pinterest, I'm recording every interaction that you're doing on my web forms, for instance. So every time you enter into a text field, or you blur a text field, or you click a button, or you dismiss a modal, that's all getting recorded for later analysis. That way, by having the data in the bank, effectively, I can go back and run my queries over that data in the future. So say I might want to know, how does a Japanese female on an iOS device treat this web page differently than someone in America? So I can go back and query that data and come up with some sort of gut instinct on an experiment to run next. You also have to pick the right metrics. So revenue is a really obvious one, and it's I think the first one that a founder would go to, but often it hides a lot of the details. So maybe you just hired a new salesperson, or you did another marketing campaign. All those things can sort of muddy the results. So if you see a lift in your revenue, you can't directly attribute it to the work that you've done on the engineering side. And finally, a point of, if you can't measure it, you can't optimize it. So measure everything. And I mentioned before that every company sort of builds their own tools to do this. So every company has a really powerful experimentation framework which their engineers build on. So basically every feature that's getting released in one of these large-scale consumer companies is released under some sort of experiment. So we measure the impact, be it a lift or a decrease in functionality across the sites. Obviously, I need to be careful on what I can share with you, so these are all publicly available images off of a Google search, but this is an example of the Pinterest analytics system. And we can see here, it outlines some of the basics of an experiment. So it's set up a control group, an enabled group, an employees group. It's got some concept of filtering. So in this one, it filters to only US customers. So this is how we would set up those filters in the dashboards. This is an Airbnb one. Looks a little bit different, but it's pretty much exactly the same content, moved around a little bit. And then I found this one from Uber, which is seemingly a little bit prettier, but same sort of thing, really. It's just viewing the different cohorts, the different treatment groups, and the uplift and declines over time. All right, and ultimately growth engineering is about nudging your users into a desired behavior. So you need to know some of the art of positioning your product for a sale. So failed founders are actually a really good source of growth engineers. So these are people that have gone through a startup, worn many hats, and had to go and literally grab those first customers and try to make those sales. So if you're looking to hire, that's a really good place to go look. It's also because 9 out of 10 startups fail, right? So there's usually a good pool of recycled founders looking for a job. So think about hiring them. All right, Adam's adage number 2. People want quarter-inch holes, not quarter-inch drill bits. This is like one of my favorite quotes. Because, and I have bad news for you, none of your customers care about you. They probably don't care about your product. They may even think that your product is awful, but they're still using it. And you have to ask yourself why. And it's because users are selfish, ultimately, at the end of the day. So I've just been installing some wall hooks in my house, some coat hooks in my entryway. And I had to go buy a drill bit to drill that hole, which was very obviously close to this analogy. But I didn't want the drill. I didn't want the drill bit. I didn't even want the drill hole. I just wanted my hook on the wall. I don't care how the hook gets on the wall. That's my goal at the end of the day. So you can understand here there's the empathy of giving customers what they want. So for me, this is a saying that's constantly in my head when I'm in meetings, thinking about what work to do. And I found it one of the hardest mental mind shifts to make. You need to have a lot of user empathy and have laser focus on your users' goals, which probably are not your business goals. So you need to find that alignment. And obviously that comes back to the design psychology side of things. So it's only really by understanding your users deeply that you can create the right solution to their problem. So Adam's adage number 3, an inch wide and a mile deep. You need to know the person that you're building for. So general solutions do not work generally. So what I mean by that is you need to have some sort of persona in mind when you're designing your products and using a user-centered design process. So what are your users' goals? How do they think about the world? So all this is important to pick the right features that you want to test and experiment on and try to find those solutions. So in the Pinterest case, if we look at building an advertising business on Pinterest, most users doing digital advertising today are probably coming from Facebook. So if I put myself in a Facebook user coming into the Pinterest platform, if the advertiser tools look completely different than Facebook, if we use completely different terminology to describe how to set up an advertising campaign, there's obviously that cognitive mismatch, and people are going to struggle to adopt our tools. So as a growth engineer, my first thought would be, right, let's make those mental models consistent, let's use the same terminology, probably take as much of the Facebook interface as possible to make it a consistent and frictionless experience. So perception is really important. I want to include at least one fun slide on this, sort of related. This is very loose, but can someone yell out when they recognize the person on the next slide? All right, Ricky Gervais. So this is a really loose connection here, but what I'm saying is that perception is not reality. So you have to have a lot of empathy with the end user and understand their perception of the world. And often perceptions misalign. So this is interesting on a psychological point of view because our brains have a whole bunch of processing units inside it on recognizing faces. When it's upside down, that's fine, but when we fix it the right way up, all of a sudden it goes bad, but there we go. And then on the engineering side, so the prime goal of the engineering side is to break down the overall goals of the user and the metrics that you're collecting into the smallest pieces possible. So you want to be shipping very small pieces very rapidly. Looking for signals. So the whole point of this is to find the next path. So we want to be trying a whole bunch of different experiments, very small little shipped things, and just waiting and measuring and seeing which of these show the most promise. And that's the one that will feed back into the loop next time. And I think you should never limit yourself to writing code. The goal is always growth, not engineering as such. So strangely, what it means for an engineer is to do as little engineering as possible. And I think a good example of this came up recently where we were working on a new marketing webpage for the Pinterest advertising product. And there's 3 different treatments that we wanted to try, 3 different marketing messages. So the first instinct is, well, let's build 3 different versions of the page and we'll release them and then we'll measure them. And that makes sense. That way we get a good experimental comparison between the 3. But how do we do less work? Well, one way we could do it is if we're using Google AdWords to drive to those pages, what if we just set up 3 different Google AdWords and we just change the text on those campaigns? Send them to the same page. Just do no work even. Don't make a new page at all. Just test the messages on the Google Ads. And then I'd say don't be afraid to do unscalable work. As an engineer, it's a very natural instinct to automate away the pain points. The problem with growth engineering is you don't want to overcommit too early to doing that. So if you need to run a spreadsheet or some large SQL query which might take 10 hours manually every day, it's best to do that first of all rather than spending 2 weeks building the automated solution. And you can always go back and automate things in the future. And adage number 4, perfect is the enemy of done. So that comes back to shipping the small pieces. Don't be afraid to ship out something that's not the best solution in the world if all you're doing is trying to find some of that early signal. And you can take those results from that little crappy experiment, feed it back into the loop, build the next experiment just a little bit better, and keep doing that over and over again, and eventually you'll iterate yourself to the great solution. Growth engineering is also broken down into the stage of the user funnel. So there's acquisition growth, which might be how do I optimize the sign-up form. There's conversion growth on, we've got a user who's signed up, but they're on a free trial, or maybe they're on the free product, we want to convert them up to a paid product. There's engagement, which is we have this feature on the product, but people don't really understand how to use it, and they're not getting value from it. How do we help users to comprehend this part of the product to make it better? And there's retention. So churn is obviously a really expensive thing for a business, so you want to keep the users inside the product and keep them engaged in the product. All right, an interactive part of the presentation. A vote from the audience. If you had to choose between optimizing for growth or optimizing for retention, who would optimize for growth? That's exactly wrong. So, churn is a limiting function of your business. So you should always be plugging the leaky user funnel first, or otherwise all you're going to have is users going through your funnel and falling out the bottom, and they're probably going to be burnt by that stage. They're going to have bad feelings about your product, and you may not have them coming back ever again. Also, if you're focusing on retention, so low churn, that low churn number is going to mean that you've found product market fit. It's a really good signal that your business is on a really good path. So if we think about a business, say they had a $20 million annual recurring revenue business today, and they have a 50% churn rate. If we do that math, it seems obvious that they're going to have to add $10 million worth of new business every year to account for that lost 50%. So to grow 0% that year, they need to do $10 million worth of new business. And that's really difficult. So focus on growing your business through retention first of all. And the important bit about this slide is what I'm talking about here with growth, the process, is also the same process that you can do for retention. It's all about picking the right metrics. So if my metric for growth might be measuring new user signups, then on the retention side, I'd want to make sure that the count deactivations are being dropped. Okay, so working our way around the start of the loop, how to make growth bets. So a growth bet is basically an idea of a feature that you want to experiment with that you think might give you increased growth. So there's usually a business theme assigned by the executives for the quarter or the half of the year. And they've usually got some pretty good guttural instinct on what's going to drive growth for the business in the future. So they're really important to have in the room. You should also be including your engineers and the designers. The reason here is the engineers are going to try to suggest things that are as lazy as possible. So what's the smallest feature that we can ship with the best return on investment? They'll also have an idea about what's really expensive work for them to do. So they're the ones who are in the code base. They know the parts of the code base that are really difficult to work with, and maybe I help guide things. Customer support, your front line. So these are the people that are on the emails and the phones with the customers on a day-to-day basis, and they really understand the pain that your customers are feeling. So they're really good to have in the room to throw those ideas around. So at the output of this, you want to have a whole bunch of ideas. And they want to be based around a qualitative, quantitative, and intuition. So qualitative might be something like a user survey. So maybe you've emailed out surveys to your users asking for feedback on the product, or maybe it's one-on-one interviews like your customer service have run with the customers on the phone. Quantitative could be an example of the logs that you've collected. So maybe you've got a whole bunch of logs about user behavior. You can go off and run queries on that, and they'll give you an instinct onto where the products are succeeding or failing. And then there's intuition. So intuition shouldn't be undercounted, I suppose. There's a lot of really great ideas come from just left field gut. So once you've got that list of ideas, it's time to start making some big bets and some small bets. And when you're doing this, you want to define an MVE, which is my made-up term for a minimum viable experiment. So you want to do the smallest thing possible in your test. Because engineering is really expensive. Sending your engineers off to a whole bunch of work with maybe zero gain or maybe even a loss is a waste of time. So try to think of the smallest thing possible. And that also keeps your experiment as fair and unbiased as possible. Step 3, so coming back to focusing on the user. In this case, which of these ideas that you've got do you think are actually going to solve the user problems? So having those user personas sort of written down so you know an example customer and put yourself in their seat and sort of play through those bets and see what's going to be working for them. And keep thinking about the quarter-inch holes. Does this user actually want this thing you're thinking of building? What is the problem you're solving? What is the outcome that they actually want? And I wanted to raise kind of a different in the mindset between a normal product person versus a growth engineering person's mindset. So it's a very natural thing when we go to define a business that we go and find a problem in the market. And then we come up with a solution and we build a product to solve that. And ultimately, we built this thing and we want to go sell it, so we go and get the marketing team to write up the marketing page to go and take the product we've built and sell it to the potential customers. And I think we need to do a slight mental shift here, which is rather to take the user goals and let those drive the product initially. So instead of marketing back with our language to the customers at the end of this, what we're actually doing is taking the terms and the mental thinking that the customers are expressing originally and building the product to suit that goal. So I think of that around like search engine optimization. what you're doing is you're searching for the search terms that people are searching for already, and then you're building the content to suit it. So it's kind of just a little slight tweak in the mindset. Step 4 is to think about how those bets are going to work in your flywheel. So most of these companies have a concept of a flywheel, which is the value exchange around the system. So this is an example of the Ubers one, which I found from Greylock Partners. And in here, they define things like, by subsidizing the fares, they'll get more people riding on Ubers. And by having more people running on Ubers, you'll get more driver utilization, and that increases the driver earnings, and so on. So whenever you do a feature which is working on one of these points of the flywheel, you're spinning the flywheel faster and faster each time. And you're trying to get more times around the loop, obviously. So think about where your flywheel is, where the value exchange is, and how you can add value in each of those steps. Step 5, and this is maybe controversial, but choose your customers. So some customers are really difficult to work with. They may be really expensive to deal with. So maybe they require a lot of customer support or others. So instead, try to focus on customers that are naturally a great fit for your product. Step 6, create a spreadsheet of your bets. For each of those rows in your spreadsheet, assign a cost, so an engineering difficulty, or perhaps maybe there's a resource cost. Predict the return on the investment of that potential feature, and then basically stack rank them all. So take the best bets that you can and run them up. And with each of those bets, go and write a hypothesis document. So the experiment doc needs to define what is the thing you're testing. It also needs to find the success metric. So you need to say up front, by looking at the number of new users signed up from Japan on an iOS device for female users, that is going to be a success metric for this. And try to be really specific on that. And then define the control and the treatment groups. So control is what is on the website today. The treatment group is, here is the difference that I am testing. You can have multiple treatments in an experiment. It just takes a little bit more work to analyze potentially. And then you just want to run and monitor these experiments. Again, this comes back to statistical significance. You need to have enough users going through the experiment to get that significance level. If you're on a lower traffic website, you can still do this. You're just going to need to run the experiments for longer. And there are some good tools online. So this is the KISS metric A/B significance test, and this will, you can plug in the amount of traffic required, and it will tell you how much traffic is required to get the significance. And as part of recently talking to other businesses around the place, I found this number. So 2/3. This is actually the number of failures that a growth engineering team expects. So 2/3 of your experiments are going to fail. Coming on to the last end of this, how do you build the team? So when should you hire a growth team? And what I would say to this group is actually a lot earlier than you expect. So the advice I've been given is once you get over 10 engineers, you should start to be focusing on growth engineering. And they have a dual purpose initially in the early stages. So a tiger team, or what Zero called a sniper team. And a sniper team can do double duty as a retention team and a bug fixing team and a growth team. So you can like mix and match in the early stages as needed. So your first hires, a project manager is probably going to be your first hire. I would say you want someone from an entrepreneurial background. So failed founders are really good at this. And someone who's got a good bit of data experience, data analysis, data science experience is really helpful. PM experience is useful, but not required, I don't think. Engineers, same sort of thing, failed founders. You want someone who's pretty full stack because they need to be flexible enough to work across difficult code bases. And they need to be really good at communication. So communication's sometimes not a natural attribute of an engineer, but you're going to want them to be communicating with other external teams and the business side. You also probably want to hire a data scientist, someone who's actually got a lot of experience with SQL queries and running big data stuff and setting up the experiments. They also need to be a little bit of a coder, so some of your data won't be immediately available in a SQL database, and they might need to do some transformations. Okay, so in year one, I think you need to first of all go identify your channels. And channels have a life cycle. So sometimes they'll be on the incline, sometimes they'll be on a decline. This may be marketing channels, it may be surface areas within your product as you add in new features. This is a new opportunity to do growth on those. So constantly be looking for new channels. And then tooling. So I said before, like most companies build their own tools, and that's true, but there are some tools which we can get off the shelf. But the most important thing is that you need a clean data set. So try to clean up any data sources that you do have so that you think they're reliable. And then try to set up a review process for the experiments. So make sure that you get sign-off from your data scientist for any experiments that the engineers want to run. And they'll just be the best people to give good feedback on what is a biased or a fair experiment. So the tool that I probably would recommend off the shelf is something like Optimizely. You could probably get away with open source tools or Google Analytics, but I think paying for something which is quite a powerful tool is, in the early days, this will do most of the things that you need them to do. AWS also has a whole bunch of reference architectures, and this one is based around doing the log collection, storing onto Elasticsearch, and then you can use internal tools into AWS. So if you're more AWS technically inclined, you can probably get away with a lot of this. Also establish a user research process. So I said before that intuition is really important, and that sort of comes back to user research too. If you're just looking at your own data constantly, there's a bit of an echo chamber effect. So always be going out and talking to your customers and getting their actual feedback. And finally, expect change. As I said, this is a really young field. There's only really handfuls of teams around the world doing this at this stage. So expect to fail, expect to learn and iterate and improve those processes constantly. And that's pretty much it. So measure what you're doing, figure out the minimum viable experiment, run those experiments, analyze the data, ship or abandon your experiments as soon as you have the statistical significance, and then iterate. Just keep moving. Cool, well, thank you very much.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Adam. That was a great sharing session from Adam on growth engineering, right? Okay, without further ado, I just would like to remind you guys, everyone has this, right? The survey form. Okay, please fill the survey form, and you guys gonna redeem prizes later on around 6:30 p.m. We have great, nice prizes, as in PS4, Starbucks cards, and many more. Okay, so okay, I'm gonna open Q&A session to the floor. Anyone? It's okay.
Hello. Hello. All right. Hello. Hi. I would like to ask you. I mean, customer empathy is quite predominant here. You talk a lot about customer empathy, right? So basically, what would be the most efficient and what is the best way of doing customer empathy? Is it interviewing, first-hand information about the customer, and also a little bit about Pinterest. Pinterest is, to me, is quite unique in a form of value proposition. So how did they educate that kind of value propositions to the market in the first place?
Yeah, sure. So question one, how do you build empathy? I think that's right. Like, there's a lot of really easy things that you can do. You can go very complex. You can set up HCI labs of one-way mirrors and like interviews and that sort of stuff. And a lot of that's overkill. So there's the idea of like guerrilla user research. So literally sitting down with a customer it's important to go to them rather than them coming to you, I think. So if you go and sit in their workplace and see how they go about their day and how they're using your tools and what sort of problems they're trying to solve, I think that's the most obvious way and immediate way to get user feedback and build the empathy. On question two, how did Pinterest express its value proposition? Or
is collections of ideas, right? Basically, is
to unleash the human's creativity in that sense. But how did they educate that kind of quite upscale value propositions to the mass market?
Right.
Yep.
So Pinterest bills itself as the catalog of ideas. And like one of the first growth engineering stories that we have at Pinterest was the head of growth, a guy called John Egan. He picked up this project where we were sending a bunch of emails to customers, and these emails were trying to get them to engage in the product. And so we literally, an engineer was sitting down, typing in a new email, subject line, and some content, and committing it to the source code, and then it would get sent. And we saw like mediocre sort of lift from this. But we had hundreds of ideas. So what we did was literally figure out a way to automate this. So instead of running one experiment for the week, we actually engineered a system that allowed us to run 300 in the week. So we'd create a spreadsheet of all the bunch of different ideas that we thought could be a potential uplift. And then the email system takes from those and renders templates in different multivariate ways and sends them out. And by having effectively a shotgun approach, so all these different variations of emails, we managed to find the ones that resonate the best with users. We've measured the click-throughs on those emails. And from that, we can sort of find what resonates the best. And we know, like at Pinterest, there's certain segments which resonate best with our customers based on that data. So like home and beauty, fashion, beauty, home, those sort of things, cooking. So a lot of that does come from analyzing your data sources.
Thank you. Any more questions from the floor? Okay.
Thank you. Sorry, thank you for the talk. Just a question on going back to what you were saying about designing for personas. So how do you segment your customers to create those personas when you start the design? So I've seen mainly segmenting by age and by income. So you think of your young professional, yada yada. But of course, the consumer goods companies are starting to look at sort of core values. The pollsters are looking at their 5-point psychometric behavioral profiles. So what do you think is the most effective way? And perhaps how have you seen it done in Pinterest, Service Hero, PVC?
Yep. I mean, that's a really interesting question, and I think it changes a lot at the scale of the company. So once you get up to something like Pinterest scale, Pinterest is effectively for everyone. It's very difficult to find niche persona types. But by looking at the data, we do find that we're very effective in something like women's fashion or cooking or these sort of things. And from that, we can obviously go and query our own data, so we can find, like Tom Kelly was talking about in the keynote the other day, that this woman started with 3 followers, and then she posted this pin on this pinata cookies, and then a week later she's got 1 million followers on Pinterest. So we can sort of see those trends, and we can see who's a really successful user of Pinterest. So when I talk about choosing your customer, that's something you can certainly do at that scale, is you can go find the users who get the most value from your system and then create them as a persona type. And persona types can get quite complex, so it could be, here's a photo of a person, here's a made-up name, here's a description of them, here's what their family is like, here's what they wear. When it comes down to early stage startups, I think it's a lot more, who's your first customers? So the first customers that you generally get are obviously the best fit for your business. So they have a really good example of your persona. The main advantage you've got at that level is you've literally got a human being that you can take your product to and say, here, does this suit what you need? Whereas a general persona in a later stage is a lot more like empathy driven. You need to sort of put yourself in their shoes and run through it. And it's not always as effective.
Thank you, Adam. One last question from the floor. Okay, maybe I'll go for 2 last questions.
Great presentation. Thanks. So, can you touch a little bit on the psychology of social signaling, where people are using like visually oriented apps like Pinterest to signal to their peers what their tastes are like? And would this be a very good way to leverage on getting people to engage with your apps?
So like the influence of the social network on growth and okay. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting as you compare against different consumer products. So Pinterest versus Instagram versus Snapchat. So Snapchat is probably the best direct competitor today with Pinterest, given its scale. They've recently IPO'd, and they take a general same sort of experimental advertising budgets that Pinterest would take. If we look at the social network features of that, though, so on Snapchat, there is no ability to like a piece of content. So you got views, but there's no feedback mechanism based on likes. There's no like count. If you look on Pinterest, it's basically all built about repins. So how much engagement has that piece of content gotten? So there's definitely different ways of doing this. Snapchat's value proposition is effectively there is no feedback loop. So if you compare Snapchat to Instagram, they're pretty much doing the same thing. So you're posting images to friends, but on Instagram, you've got a like functionality. And there's a permanence to that. So you've got this piece of content on Instagram, which is liked 1,000 times, and it never goes away. That's a good way for someone building a reputation on Instagram to build themselves up. Snapchat, on the other hand, its popularity is based on the fact that it doesn't exist. So you're not worrying about the popularity of the content you're creating. So people create more content because they're less worried about being judged. So yes, the social network effects are like really important for building a product and getting growth. But you can also look at the counterexamples in some interesting ways. And it's all about matching that user need again. So let's talk about Snapchat matching younger consumers, people who don't want to be having their life permanently recorded. They want these things to live for a short time and then drop off. So good examples. But yeah, lots of opportunities.
Thank you. Another last question.
Hi, Adam. So, question. I've always read this term called optimizing too early. Like in the stage of startup growing, you have a small engineering team. You have to build like tons of features, tons of products, and then you need to set aside time to also optimize. Like, is there such thing as optimizing too early, or like, how do you strike a balance?
Hi, Umar. Yeah, so the quote is, premature optimization is the root of all evil. And that's definitely something that's true. It's especially true in engineering, but I think it's generally true in like product design. So this is why we're doing like user-centered design, I think. So we're working to create prototypes before engineering, if at all possible. So wireframe, sort of sketches, or you're building out an Envision document, a prototype, before getting to engineering. Basically, we don't know what the customer wants yet. So I think the growth cycle, the experimentation loop, all sort of comes in. But I think at the very early stages, you want to do it without that sort of formal process quite yet. Generally, because any small change, you're generally not making very small changes. You're making like pretty large changes in the early stages. And the results of that are pretty immediately obvious because you've got 5 customers. And you can literally just go and ask them. It's only sort of once you scale up, and then you can sort of focus on the macro level. And then once you get to Pinterest scale, where you've got millions of visits a day, you can sort of work down to the micro optimization level. But yeah, don't optimize too early, especially in early stage startups.
Okay, thank you. That's all, I guess, for the Q&A session. Okay, round of applause again for Adam, everyone.
Thank you.